events which took place at the Norton Mine on October 18th and 19th, 1894, I have no desire to speak. A sense of duty to science is all that impels me to recall, in these last years of my life, scenes and happenings fraught with a terror doubly acute, because I cannot wholly define it, but I believe that before I die, I should tell what I know of the, shall I say, transition of Juan Romero. My name and origin need not be related to posterity. In fact, I fancy it is better that they should not be, for when a man suddenly migrates to the States or the colonies, he leaves his past behind him. Besides, what I once was is not in the least relevant to my narrative, save perhaps the fact that during my service in India, I was more at home amongst white-bearded native teachers than amongst my brother officers. I have delved not a little into odd Eastern lore when overtaken by the calamities which brought about my new life in America's vast West, a life wherein I found it well to accept a name, my present one, which is very common and carries no meaning. In the summer and autumn of 1894, I dwelt in the drear expanses of the Cactus Mountains, employed as a common laborer at the celebrated Norton Mine, whose discovery by an aged prospector some years before had turned the surrounding region from a nearly unpeopled waste to a seething cauldron of sordid life, a cavern of gold, lying deep below a mountain lake, hadn't reached its venerable finder beyond his wildest dreams, and now formed the seat of extensive tunneling operations on the part of the corporation to which it had finally been sold. Additional grottos had been found, and the yield of yellow metal was exceedingly great, so that a mighty and heterogeneous army of miners toiled day and night in the numerous passages and rock hollows. The superintendent, a Mr. Arthur, often discussed the singularity of the local geological formations, speculating on the probable extent of the chain of caves and estimating the future of the titanic mining enterprise. He considered the auriferous cavities the result of the action of water and believed the last of them would soon be opened. It was not long after my arrival and employment that Juan Romero came to the Northern Mine. One of the large herd of unkempt Mexicans attracted thither from the neighboring country, he at first commanded attention only because of his features, which, though plainly of the Red Indian type, were yet remarkable for their light color and refined conformation, being vastly unlike those of the average greaser or Paiute of the locality. It is curious that although he differed so widely from the mass of Hispanicized and tribal Indians, Romero gave not the least impression of Caucasian blood. It was not the Castilian conquistador or the American pioneer, but the ancient and noble Aztec whom imagination called to view when the silent peon would rise in the early morning and gaze in fascination at the sun as it crept above the eastern hills, meanwhile stretching out his arms to the orb, as if in the performance of some rite whose nature he did not himself comprehend. But save for his face, Romero was not in any way suggestive of nobility. Ignorant and dirty, he was at home among the other brown-skinned Mexicans, having come, so I was afterward told, from the very lowest sort of surroundings. He had been found as a child in a crude mountain hut, the only survivor of an epidemic which had stalked lethally by. Near the hut, close to a rather unusual rock fissure, had lain two skeletons, newly picked by vultures, and presumably forming the sole remains of his parents. No one recalled their identity, and they were soon forgotten by the many. Indeed, the crumbling of the adobe hut and the closing of the rock fissure a subsequent avalanche had helped to efface even the scene from recollection, reared by a Mexican cattle thief who had given him his name. Juan differed little from his fellows. The attachment which Romero manifested toward me was undoubtedly commenced through the quaint and ancient Hindu ring which I wore when not engaged in active labor. Of its nature and manner of coming into my possession I cannot speak. It was my last link with a chapter of life forever closed, and I valued it highly. Soon I observed that the odd-looking Mexican was likewise interested, eyeing it with an expression that banished all suspicion of mere covetousness. Its hoary hieroglyphs seemed to stir some faint recollection in his untutored but active mind, though he could not possibly have beheld their like before. Within a few weeks after his advent, Romero was like a faithful servant to me, this notwithstanding the fact that I was myself but an ordinary miner. Our conversation was necessarily limited. He knew but a few words of English, while I found my Oxonian Spanish was something quite different from the patois of the peon of New Spain. The event which I am about to relate was unheralded by long premonitions, though the man Romero had interested me, and though my ring had affected him peculiarly, I think that neither of us had any expectation of what was to follow when the great blast was set off. Geological considerations had dictated an extension of the mine directly downward from the deepest part of the subterranean area. The belief of the superintendent that only solid rock would be encountered had led to the placing of a prodigious charge of dynamite. With this work Romero and I were not connected, wherefore our first knowledge of extraordinary conditions came from others. The charge, heavier perhaps than had been estimated, had seemed to shake the entire mountain. Windows in shanties on the slope outside were shattered by the shock, whilst miners throughout the nearer passages were knocked from their feet. Jewel Lake, which lay above the scene of action, heaved as in a tempest. Upon investigation, it was seen that a new abyss yawned indefinitely below the seat of the blast, an abyss so monstrous that no handy line might fathom it, nor any lamp illuminate it. Baffled, the excavators sought a conference with the superintendent, who ordered great lengths of rope to be taken to the pit and spliced without cessation till a bottom might be discovered. Shortly afterward, the pale-faced workmen apprised the superintendent of their failure. Firmly though respectfully, they signified their refusal to revisit the chasm, or indeed to work further in the mine until it might be sealed. Something beyond their experience was evidently confronting them, for so far as they could ascertain, the void below was infinite. The superintendent did not reproach them. Instead, he pondered deeply and made many plans for the following day. The night shift did not go on that evening. At 2 in the morning, a lone coyote on the mountain began to howl dismally. From somewhere within the works, a dog barked in answer, either to the coyote or to something else. A storm was gathering around the peaks of the range, and weirdly shaped clouds scudded horribly across the blurred patch of celestial light which marked the gibbous moon's attempts to shine through many layers of cirrostratus vapors. It was Romero's voice, coming from the bunk above, that awaked me. A voice excited and tense with some vague expectation I could not understand. Madre de Dios, el sonido, ese sonido, oiga vidi, lo oye vidi, Señor, that sound. I listened, wondering what sound he meant. The coyote, the dog, the storm, all were audible. The last named, now gaining ascendancy as the wind shrieked more and more frantically. Flashes of lightning were visible through the bunkhouse window. I questioned the nervous Mexican, repeating the sounds I had heard. El coyote, el perro, el viento. But Romero did not reply. Then he commenced whispering, as in awe, El ritmo, señor, el ritmo de la tierra that throbbed down in the ground. And now I also heard and shivered, and without knowing why. Deep, deep below me was a sound, a rhythm, just as the peon had said, which though exceedingly faint, yet dominated even the dog, the coyote, and the increasing tempest. To seek to describe it were useless, for it was such that no description is possible. Perhaps it was like the pulsing of the engines far down in a great liner, as sensed from the deck, yet it was not so mechanical, not so devoid of the element of life and consciousness. Of all its qualities, remoteness in the earth most impressed me. To my mind rushed fragments of a passage in Joseph Glanville, which Poe has quoted with tremendous effect. The vastness, profundity, and unsearchableness of his works, which have a depth in them greater than the well of Democritus. Suddenly Romero leaped from his bunk, pausing before me to gaze at the strange ring on my hand, which glistened queerly in every flash of lightning, and then staring intently in the direction of the mine shaft. I also rose, and both stood motionless for a time, straining our ears, as the uncanny rhythm seemed more and more to take on a vital quality. Then, without apparent volition, we began to move toward the door, whose rattling in the gale held a comforting suggestion of earthly reality. The chanting in the depths, for such the sound now seemed to me, grew in volume and distinctness, and we felt irresistibly urged out into the storm, and thence to the gaping blackness of the shaft. We encountered no living creature, for the man of the night shift had been released from duty, and were doubtless at the Dry Gulch settlement, pouring sinister rumors into the ear of some drowsy bartender. From the watchman's cabin, however, gleamed a small square of yellow light, like a guardian eye. I dimly wondered how the rhythmic sound had affected the watchman, but Romero was moving more swiftly now, and I followed without pausing. As we descended the shaft, the sound beneath grew indefinitely composite. It struck me as horribly like a sort of oriental ceremony, with beating of drums and chanting of many voices. I have, as you are aware, been much in India. Romero and I moved without material hesitancy through drifts and down ladders, ever toward the thing that allured us, yet ever with a pitifully helpless fear and reluctance. At one time I fancied I had gone mad. This was when, on wondering how our way was lighted in the absence of lamp or candle, I realized that the ancient ring on my finger was glowing with eerie radiance, diffusing a pallid luster through the damp, heavy air around. It was without warning that Romero, after clambering down one of the many rude ladders, broke into a run and left me alone. Some new and wild note in the drumming and chanting, perceptible but slightly to me, had acted on him in startling fashion, and with a wild outcry he forged ahead, unguided, in the cavern's gloom. I heard his repeated shrieks before me, as he stumbled awkwardly along the level places and scrambled madly down the rickety ladders. And frightened as I was, I yet retained enough of perception to know that his speech, when articulate, was not of any sort known to me. Harsh but impressive polysyllables had replaced the customary mixture of bad Spanish and worse English, and of these only the oft-repeated cry Huitzilopochtli seemed in the least familiar. Later, I definitely placed that word in the works of a great historian, and shuddered when the association came to me. The climax of that awful night was composite but fairly brief, beginning just as I had reached the final cavern of the journey. Out of the darkness, immediately ahead burst a final shriek from the Mexican, which was joined by such a chorus of uncouth sound as I could never hear again and survive. In that moment, it seemed as if all the hidden terrors and monstrosities of Earth had become articulate in an effort to overwhelm the human race. Simultaneously, the light from my ring was extinguished, and I saw a new light glimmering from lower space, but a few yards ahead of me. I had arrived at the abyss, which was now redly aglow, and which had evidently swallowed up the unfortunate Romero. Advancing, I peered over the edge of that chasm, which no line could fathom, and which was now a pandemonium of flickering flame and hideous uproar. At first, I beheld nothing but a seething blur of luminosity, but then shapes, all infinitely distant, began to detach themselves from the confusion, and I saw, was it Juan Romero? But God, I dare not tell you what I saw. Some power from heaven, coming to my aid, obliterated both sides and sounds in such a crash as may be heard when two universes collide in space. Chaos supervened, and I knew the peace of oblivion. I hardly know how to continue, since conditions so singular are involved, but I will do my best, not even trying to differentiate betwixt the real and the apparent. When I awaked, I was safe in my bunk, and the red glow of dawn was visible at the window. Some distance away, the lifeless body of Juan Romero lay upon a table, surrounded by a group of men, including the camp doctor. The men were discussing the strange death of the Mexican as he lay asleep, a death seemingly connected in some way with the terrible bolt of lightning which had struck and shaken the mountain. No direct cause was evident, and an autopsy failed to shew any reason why Romero should not be living. Snatches of conversation indicated beyond a doubt that neither Romero nor I had left the bunkhouse during the night, that neither had been awake during the frightful storm which had passed over the Cactus Range. That storm, said men who had ventured down the mine shaft, had caused extensive caving in, and had completely closed the deep abyss which had created so much apprehension the day before. When I asked the watchman what sounds he had heard prior to the mighty thunderbolt, he mentioned a coyote, a dog, and the snarling mountain wind. Nothing more, nor do I doubt his word. Upon the resumption of the work, Superintendent Arthur called on some specially dependable men to make a few investigations around the spot where the gulf had appeared. Though hardly eager, they obeyed, and a deep boring was made. Results were very curious. The roof of the void, as seen whilst it was open, was not by any means thick, yet now the drills of the investigators met what appeared to be a limitless extent of solid rock. Finding nothing else, not even gold, the superintendent abandoned his attempts, but a perplexed look occasionally steals over his countenance as he sits thinking at his desk. One other thing is curious. Shortly after waking on that morning after the storm, I noticed the unaccountable absence of my Hindu ring from my finger. I had prized it greatly, yet nevertheless felt a sensation of relief at its disappearance. If one of my fellow miners appropriated it, he must have been quite clever in disposing of his booty, for despite advertisements and a police search, the ring was never seen again. Somehow I doubt if it was stolen by mortal hands, for many strange things were taught to me in India. My opinion of my whole experience varies from time to time. In daylight, and at most seasons I am apt to think the greater part of it a mere dream, but sometimes in the autumn, about 2 in the morning, when winds and animals howl dismally, there comes from inconceivable depths below a damnable suggestion of rhythmical throbbing, and I feel that the transition of Juan Romero was a terrible one indeed. As a wolf spies upon its hunters, John Reynolds watched his pursuers. He lay close in a thicket on the slope, an inferno of hate seething in his heart. He had ridden hard up the slope behind him, where the dim path wound up out of Lost Valley. His crank-eyed Mustang stood, head drooping, trembling after the long run. Below him, not more than 80 yards away, stood his enemies, fresh come from the slaughter of his kinsmen. In the clearing, frothing Ghost Cave, they had dismounted and were arguing among themselves. John Reynolds knew them all with an old, bitter hate. The black shadow of feud lay between them and himself. The feuds of early Texas have been neglected by chroniclers who have sung the feuds of the Kentucky mountains, though the men who first settled the Southwest were of the same breed as those mountaineers. But there was a difference. In the mountain country, feuds dragged on for generations. On the Texas frontier, they were short, fierce, and appallingly bloody. The Reynolds-McCreel feud was long, as Texas feuds went. 15 years had passed since old S.O. Reynolds stabbed young Braxton McCreel to death with his Bowie knife in the saloon of Antelope Wells, in a quarrel over ranch rights. For 15 years, the Reynoldses and their kin, the Brills, Allisons, and Donnellys, had been at open war with the McCreels and their kin, the Killers, the Fletchers, and the Orts. There had been ambushes in the hills, murders on the open range, and gunfights in the streets of the little coal towns. Each clan had rustled the other's cattle wholesale. Gunmen and outlaws, called in by both sides to participate for pay, had spread a reign of terror and lawlessness throughout the vicinity. Settlers shunned the war-torn range. The feud became a red obstacle in the way of progress and development, a savage retrogression which was demoralizing the whole countryside. Little John Reynolds cared. He had grown up in the atmosphere of the feud, and it had become a burning obsession with him. The war had taken a fearful toll on both clans, but the Reynolds clan had suffered most. John was the last of the fighting Reynoldses, for Izzo, the grim old patriarch who ruled the clan, would never again walk or sit in a saddle with his legs paralyzed by McGrill bullets. John had seen his brothers shot down from ambush or killed in pitched battles. Now the last stroke had nearly wiped out the waning clan. John Reynolds cursed as he thought of the trap into which they had walked in the saloon of Antelope Wells. The hidden foes had opened their murderous fire without warning. There had fallen his cousin, Bill Donnelly, his sister's son, young Jonathan Brill, his brother-in-law, Job Ellison, and Steve Kearney, the hired gunman. Now he himself had shot his way through and gained the hitching rack. Untouched by the blasting hail of lead, John Reynolds hardly knew. They had pressed him so closely he had not time to mount his long, lamed range bay, but had been forced to take the first horse they came to, the crank-eyed, speedy, but short-witted Mustang of the dead Jonathan Brill. He had distanced his pursuers for a while, had gained the uninhabited hills, and swung back into mysterious Lost Valley with its silent thickets and crumbling stone columns, where he intended to double back over the hills in this valley. He was riding that Mustang and he didn't ever have no guts. I bet it'd give plumb out him in time he got this far. Well, came the voice of Saul Fletcher, what we standing around powwowing for? Why don't we start hunting him? Not so fast, growled old Jonas. Remember, it's John Reynolds we're chasing. We got plenty of time. John Reynolds' fingers hardened on the stock of his single-action .45. There were 2 cartridges unfired in the cylinder. He pushed the muzzle through the stems of the thicket in front of him, his thumb drawing back the wicked-fanged hammer. His grey eyes narrowed and became opaque as ice as he sighted down the long blue barrel. An instant he weighed his hatred and chose Saul Fletcher. All the hate in his soul centered for an instant in that brutal back-bearded face and the limping tread he had heard that night he lay wounded in the besieged corral with his brother's riddled corpse beside him, and fought off Saul and his brothers. John Reynolds' finger crooked, and the crash of the shot broke the echoes of the sleeping hills. Saul Fletcher swayed, flinging his black beard drunkenly upward, and crashed face down and headlong. The others, with the quickness of men accustomed to frontier warfare, dropped behind rocks, and their answering shots roared back as they combed the slope blindly. The bullets tore through the thickets, whistling over the unseen killer's head. High up on the slope, the Mustang, out of sight of the man in the valley, but frightened by the noise, screamed shrilly and rearing, snapped the reins that held him and fled away up the hill path. The drum of his hoofs on the stones dwindled in the distance. Silence reigned for an instant. Then came Jonas McGrill's wrathful voice. I told you he was riding here. Come out of there. He's got clean away. The old fighter's rangy frame rose up from behind a rock where he had taken refuge. Reynolds, grinning fiercely, took steady aim. Then some instinct of self-preservation held his hand. The others came out into the open. What are we waiting on? Yelled young Bill Ord, tears of rage in his eyes. Here that coyote's done shot Saul, and it's riding hell for leather away from here, and we're standing around John. I'm going to. He started for his horse. You're gonna listen to me, roared old Jonas. I warned you to go slow, but you would come lickety-slip along like a bunch of blind buzzards, and now Saul's laying there dead. If we ain't careful, John Reynolds will kill all of us. Didn't I tell you all he was here? Likely stopped to rest his horse. He can't go far. This here's a long hunt, like I told you at first. Let him get a good start. Long as he's ahead of us, we got to watch for ambushes. He'll try to get back onto that Reynolds range. Well, we're going after him slow and easy to keep him hazed back all the time. We'll be right in the inside of a big half circle, and he can't get by us, not on that short-winded Mustang. We'll just follow him and gather him in when his horse can do no more, and I pretty well know where he'll come to bay at. Blind Horse Canyon. We'll have to starve him out then, growled Jack Solomon. No, we won't, grinned old Jonas. Bill, you hightail it back to Antelope and get 5 or 6 sticks of dynamite. Then you get a fresh horse and follow our trail. If we catch him before he gets out to the canyon, all right. If he beats us there and holds up, we'll wait for you and then blast him out. What about Saul? Growled Peter Ord. He's dead, grunted Jonas. Nothing we can do for him now. No time to take him back. He glanced up to the sky, where already black dots wheeled against the blue. His gaze drifted to the walled-up mouth of the cavern in the steep cliff which rose at right angles to the slope up which the path wandered. We'll break open the cave and put him in it, he said. We'll pile up the rocks again, and the wolves and buzzards can get to him. Maybe several days before we get back. That cave's haunted, muttered Bill Ord uneasily. old six-shooter from the holster and shoved the weapon into his own waistband. "Poor soul," he grunted. "Sure dead. Shot plumb through the heart. Dead before he hit the ground, I reckon. Well, we'll make that damn Reynolds pay for it." They carried the dead man to the cave and, laying him down, attacked the rocks which blocked the entrance. These were soon torn aside, and Reynolds saw the men carry the body inside. They emerged almost immediately, minus their burden, and mounting their horses. Young Bill Ord swung away down the valley and vanished among trees. The rest cantered along the winding trail that led up into the hills. They passed within 100 feet of his refuge, and John Reynolds hugged the earth, fearing discovery, but they did not glance in his direction. He heard the dwindling of their hoofs over the rocky path, then silence settled again over the ancient valley. John Reynolds rose cautiously, looked about him as a hunted wolf looks, then made his way quickly down the slope. He had a very definite purpose in mind. A single unfired cartridge was all his ammunition, but about the dead body of Saul Fletcher was a belt well filled with 45 caliber cartridges. As he attacked the rocks heaped in the cave's mouth, there hovered in his mind the curious dim speculations which the cave and the valley itself aroused in him. Why had the Indians named it the Valley of the Lost, which white men shortened to Lost Valley? Why had the red men shunned it? Once in the memory of white men, a band of Kiowas, fleeing the vengeance of Bigfoot Wallace and his rangers, had taken up their abode there, and falling on evil times, the survivors of the tribe had fled, telling wild tales in which murder, fratricide, insanity, vampirism, slaughter, and cannibalism had played grim parts. Then 6 white men, brothers, Stark by name, had settled in the Lost Valley. They had reopened the cave which the Kiowas had blocked up. Horror had fallen on them, and in one night 5 died by one another's hands. The survivor had walled up the cave mouth again and departed where none knew. Word had drifted through the settlements of a man named Stark, who had come among the remnants of those Kiowas who had once lived in Lost Valley, and after a long talk with them, had cut his own throat with his bowie knife. What was the mystery of Lost Valley, if not a web of lies and legends? What the meaning of those crumbling stones, which scattered all over the valley, half hidden in a climbing growth, bore a curious symmetry, especially in the moonlight, so that some people believed, when the Indians swore they were the half-destroyed columns of a prehistoric city which once stood in Lost Valley before it crumbled into a heap of grey dust. Reynolds himself had seen a skull unearthed at the base of a cliff whipped by a wandering prospector. It seemed neither Caucasian nor Indian, a curious beaked skull, which but for the formation of the jawbones might have been that of some unknown antediluvian animal. Such thoughts flitted vaguely and momentarily through John Reynolds' mind as he dislodged the boulders which the McGrills had put back loosely, just firmly enough to keep a wolf or buzzard from squeezing through. In the main, his thoughts were engrossed with the cartridges in that Saul Fletcher's belt, a fighting chance, a lease on life. He would fight his way out of the hills yet, would bring in more gunmen and cutthroats for striking back. He would flood the whole range with blood and bring the countryside to ruin, if by those means he might be avenged. For years he had been the moving factor in the feud. When even old Esau had weakened and wished for peace, John Reynolds had kept the flame of hate blazing. The feud had become his own driving motive, his one interest in life and reason for existence. The last boulders fell aside. John Reynolds stepped into the semi-gloom of the cavern. It was not large, but the shadows seemed to cluster there in almost tangible substance. Slowly his eyes accustomed themselves, and an involuntary exclamation broke from his lips. The cave was empty. He swore in bewilderment. He had seen men carry Saul Fletcher's corpse into the cave and come out again empty-handed, yet no corpse lay on the dusty cavern floor. He went to the back of the cave, glanced at the straight, even wall, bent, and examined the smooth rock floor. His keen eyes, straining in the gloom, made out a dull smear of blood on the stone. It ended abruptly at the back wall. There was no stain on the wall. Reynolds leaned closer, supporting himself by a hand propped against the stone wall, and suddenly, shockingly, the sensation of solidity and stability vanished. The wall gave way beneath his propping hand. A section swung inward, precipitating him headlong through a black gaping opening. His cat-like quickness could not save him. It was as if the yawning shadows reached tenuous and invisible hands to jerk him headlong into the darkness. He did not fall far. His outflung hands struck what seemed to be steps carved in the stone, and on them he scrambled and floundered for an instant. Then he righted himself and turned back to the opening through which he had fallen, but the secret door had closed, and only a smooth stone wall met his groping fingers. He felt down a rising panic. How the McReals had come to know of this secret chamber he could not say, but quite evidently they had placed Saul Fletcher's body in it, and therefore, trapped like a rat, they would find John Reynolds when they returned. Then a grim smile curled Reynolds' thin lips. When they opened the secret door, he would be hidden in darkness, while they would be etched against the dim light of the outer cave. Where could he find a more perfect ambush? But first he must find the body and secure the cartridges. He turned to grope his way down the steps, and his first stride brought him to a level floor. It was a sort of narrow tunnel, he decided, for though he could not reach the roof, a stride to the right or the left, and his outstretched hand encountered a wall, seemingly too even and symmetrical to have been the work of nature. He went slowly, groping in the darkness, keeping in touch with the walls, and momentarily expecting to stumble on Saul Fletcher's body. And as he did not, a dim horror began to grow in his soul. The McReals had not been in the cavern long enough to carry the body so far back into the darkness. A feeling was rising in John Reynolds that the McReals had not entered the tunnel at all, that they were not aware of its existence. Then where, in the name of sanity, was Saul Fletcher's corpse? He stopped short, jerking out his six-shooter. Something was coming up the dark tunnel, something that walked upright and lumberingly. John Reynolds knew it was a man, wearing high-heeled riding boots. No other footwear makes the same stilted sound. He caught the jingle of the spurs, and a dark tide of nameless horror moved sluggishly in John Reynolds' mind as he heard that halting tread approach, and remembered the night when he had lain at bay in the old corral with a younger brother dying beside him, and heard a limping, dragging footstep out in the night where Saul Fletcher led his wolves and sought for a way to come upon his back. Had the man only been wounded, these steps sounded stiff and blundering, such as a wounded man might make. No, John Reynolds had seen too many men die. He knew that this bullet had gone straight through Saul Fletcher's heart, possibly tearing the heart out, certainly killing him instantly. Besides, he had heard old Jonas McReel declare the man was dead. No, Saul Fletcher lay lifeless somewhere in this black cavern. It was some other lame man who was coming up that silent tunnel. Now the tread ceased. The man was fronting him, separated only by a few feet of utter blackness. What was there in that to quicken the iron pulse of John Reynolds, who had unflinchingly faced death times without number? What to make his flesh crawl and his tongue freeze into his palate? To awake sleeping instincts of fear as a man senses the presence of an unseen serpent, and make him feel that somehow the other was aware of his presence, with eyes that pierced the darkness. In the silence, John Reynolds heard the staccato pounding of his own heart, and with shocking suddenness the man lunged. Reynolds' straining ears caught the first movement of that lunge, and he fired point blank, and he screamed, a terrible animal-like scream. Heavy arms locked upon him, and unseen teeth worried at his flesh, but in the frothing frenzy of his fear, his own strength was superhuman, for in the flash of the shot he had seen a bearded face with a slack-hanging mouth and staring dead eyes. Saul Fletcher, the dead, come back from hell. As in a nightmare, Reynolds entered a fiendish battle in the dark, where the dead sought to track down the living. He was flung with bone-shattering force against the stone walls, dashed to the floor, the silent horror squatting ghoul-like upon him, its horrid fingers sinking deep into his throat. In that nightmare, John Reynolds had no time to doubt his own sanity. He knew that he was battling a dead man. The flesh of his foe was cold with a charnel-house clamminess. Under the torn shirt he had felt the round bullet hole, caked with clotted blood. No single sound came from those loose lips. Choking and gasping, John Reynolds tore the strangling hands aside and flung the thing off. For an instant, the darkness again separated them. Then the horror came hurtling toward him again. As the thing lunged, Reynolds caught blindly and gained the wrestling hold he wished, and hurling all his power behind the attack, he dashed the horror headlong, falling upon it with his full weight. Saul Fletcher's spine snapped like a rotten branch, and the tearing hands went limp. The straining limbs relaxed. Something flowed from the lax body and whispered away through the darkness like a ghostly wind, and John Reynolds instinctively knew that at last Saul Fletcher was truly dead. Panting and shaken, Reynolds rose. The tunnel remained in utter darkness, but down it, the direction from which the walking corpse had come stalking, there whispered a faint throbbing that was hardly sound at all, yet had in its pulsing a dark weird music. Reynolds shuddered, and the sweat froze on his body. The dead man lay at his feet in the thick darkness, and faintly to his ears came that unbearably sweet, unbearably evil echo, like devil drums beating faint and far in the dim caverns of hell. Reason urged him to turn back, to fight against that blind door until he burst its stone, if human power could burst it. But he realized that reason and sanity had been left behind him. A single step had plunged him from a normal world of material realities to a realm of nightmare and lunacy. He decided that he was mad, or else dead and in hell. Those dim tom-toms drew him. They tugged at his heartstrings eerily. They repelled him and filled his soul with shadowy and monstrous conjectures, yet their call was irresistible. He fought the mad impulse to shriek and fling his arms wildly aloft, and ran down the black tunnel as a rabbit runs down the prairie dog's burrow into the jaws of the waiting rattler. Fumbling in the dark, he found his revolver, and still fumbling, he loaded it with cartridges from Saul Fletcher's belt. He felt no more aversion now at touching the body than he would have felt at handling any dead flesh. Whatever unholy power had animated the corpse, it had left it when the snapping of the spine had unraveled the nerve centers and disrupted the roots of the muscular system. Then, revolver in hand, John Reynolds went down the tunnel, drawn by a power he could not fathom, toward the doom he could not guess. The throb of the tom-toms grew only slightly in volume as he advanced. How far below the hills he was, he could not know, but the tunnel slanted downward, and he had gone a long way. Often his groping hands encountered doorways, corridors leading off the main tunnel, he believed. At last he was aware that he had left the tunnel and had come out into a vast open space. He could see nothing but he somehow felt the vastness of the place, and in the darkness a faint light began. It throbbed as the drums throbbed, waning and waxing in time to their pulsing, but it grew slowly, casting a weird glow that was more like green than any color Reynolds had ever seen, but was not really green, nor any other sane or earthly color. Reynolds approached it. It widened. It cast a shimmering radiance over the smooth stone floor, illuminating fantastic mosaics. It cast its chin high in the hovering shadows, but he could see no roof. Now he stood bathed in its weird glow, so that his flesh looked like a dead man's. Now he saw the roof, high and vaulted, brooding far above him, like a dusky midnight sky, and towering walls, gleaming and dark, sweeping up to the tremendous heights, their bases fringed with squat shadows, from which glittered other lights, small and scintillant. He saw the source of the illumination, a strange cavern stone altar on which burned what appeared to be a giant jewel of an unearthly hue, like the light it emitted. Greenish flame jetted from it. It burned as a bead of coal might burn, but it was not consumed. Just behind it, a feathered serpent reared from its coils, a fantasy carven of some clear crystalline substance, the tints of which, in the weird light, were never the same, but which pulsed and shimmered and changed as the drums, now on all sides of him, pulsed and throbbed. Abruptly, something alive moved beside the altar, and John Reynolds, though he was expecting anything, recoiled. At first he thought it was a huge reptile, which slithered about the altar. Then he saw that it stood upright as a man stands. As he met the menacing glitter of its eyes, he fired point blank, and the thing went down like a slaughtered ox. Its skull shattered. Reynolds wheeled as a sinister rustling rose on his ears. At least these beings could be killed. Then checked the lifted muzzle. The fringing shadows had moved out from the darkness at the base of the walls and drawn about him a wide ring. And though at first glance they possessed the semblance of men, he knew they were not human. The weird light flickered and danced over them, and back in the deeper darkness the soft, evil drums whispered their accompanying undertone everlastingly. John Reynolds stood aghast at what he saw. It was not their dwarfish figures which caused his shudder, nor even the unnaturally made hands and feet. It was their heads. He knew now of what race was the skull found by the prospector. Like it, these heads were peaked and malformed, curiously flattened at the sides. There was no sign of ears, as if their organs of hearing, like a serpent's, were beneath the skin. The noses were like a python's snout, the mouth and jaws much less human in appearance than his recollection of the skull would have led him to suppose. The eyes were small, glittering, and reptilian. The squamous lips writhed back, showing pointed fangs, and John Reynolds felt that their bite would be as deadly as a rattlesnake's. Garments they wore none, nor did they bear any weapons. He tensed himself for the death struggle, but no rush came. The snake people sat down cross-legged about him in a great circle, and beyond the circle he saw them massed thick. And now he felt a stirring in his consciousness, an almost tangible beating of wheels upon his senses. He was distinctly aware of a concentrated invasion of his innermost mind, and realized that these fantastic beings were seeking to convey their commands or wishes to him by medium of thought. On what common plane could he meet these inhuman creatures? Yet in some dim, strange, telepathic way they made him understand some of their meaning, and he realized with a grisly shock that, whatever these things were now, they had once been at least partly human, else they had never been able to so bridge the gulf between the completely human and the completely bestial. He understood that he was the first living man to come into their innermost realm, the first to look on the shining serpent, the terrible nameless one, who was older than the world, that before before he died, he was to know all which had been denied to the sons of men concerning the mysterious valley, that he might take this knowledge into eternity with him and discuss these matters with those who had gone before him. The drums rustled, the strange light leaped and shimmered, and before the altar came one who seemed in authority, an ancient monstrosity whose skin was like the whitish hide of an old serpent, and who wore on his peaked skull a golden circlet set with weird gems. He bent and made suppliance to the feather snake. Then with a sharp implement of some sort which left a phosphorescent mark, he drew a cryptic triangular figure on the floor before the altar, and in the figure he strewed some sort of glimmering dust. From it reared up a thin spiral, which grew to a gigantic shadowy serpent, feathered and horrific, and then changed and faded and became a cloud of greenish smoke. This smoke billowed out before John Reynolds' eyes and hid the serpent-eyed ring, and the altar and the cavern itself. All the universe dissolved into the green smoke, in which titanic scenes and alien landscapes rose and shifted and faded, and monstrous shapes slumbered and leered. Abruptly the chaos crystallized. He was looking into a valley which he did not recognize. Somehow he knew it was Lost Valley, but in it towered a gigantic city of a dully gleaming stone. John Reynolds was a man of the outlands and the waste places. He had never seen the great cities of the world, but he knew that nowhere in the world today such a city reared up to the sky. Its towers and battlements were those of an alien age. Its outline baffled his gaze with its unnatural aspects. It was a city of lunacy to the normal human eye, with its hints of alien dimensions and abnormal principles of architecture. Through it moved strange figures, human, yet of a humanity definitely different from his own. They were clad in robes. Their hands and feet were less abnormal, their ears and mouths more like those of normal humans. Yet there was an undoubted kinship between them and the monsters of the cave. It showed in the curious peaked skull, though this was less pronounced and bestial in the people of the city. He saw them in the twisting streets and in their colossal buildings, and he shuddered at the inhumaneness of their lives. Much they did was beyond his ken. He could understand their actions and motives no more than a Zulu savage might understand the events of modern London. But he did understand that these people were very ancient and very evil. He saw them enact rituals that froze his blood with horror, obscenities and blasphemies beyond his understanding. He grew sick with a sensation of contamination. Somehow he knew that this city was the remnant of an outworn age, that these people represented the survival of an epoch lost and forgotten. Then a new people came upon the scene. Over the hills came wild men clad in hides and feathers, armed with bows and flint-tipped weapons. They were, Reynolds knew, Indians, and yet not Indians as he knew them. They were slant-eyed, and their skins were yellowish rather than copper-colored. Somehow he knew that these were the nomadic ancestors of the Toltecs, wandering and conquering on their long trek before they settled in upland valleys far to the south and evolved their own special type and civilization. These were still close to the primal Mongolian rootstock, and he gasped at the gigantic vistas of time this realization evoked. Reynolds saw the warriors move like a giant wave on the towering walls. He saw the defenders man the towers and deal death in strange and grisly forms to them. He saw the invaders reel back again and again, then come on once more with the blind ferocity of the primitive. This strange evil city, filled with mysterious people of a different order, was in their path, and they could not pass until they stamped it out. Reynolds marveled at the fury of the invaders, who wasted their lives like water, matching the cruel and terrible science of an unknown civilization with sheer courage and the might of manpower. Their bodies littered the plateau, but not all the forces of hell could keep them back. They rolled like a wave to the foot of the towers. They scaled the walls in the teeth of sword and arrow, and death in ghastly forms. They gained the parapets. They met their enemies hand to hand. Bludgeons and axes beat down the lunging spears and thrusting swords. The tall figures of the barbarians towered over the smaller forms of the defenders. Red hell raged in the city. The siege became a street battle, the battle a rout, the rout a slaughter. Smoke rose and hung in clouds over the doomed city. The scene changed. Reynolds looked on charred and ruined walls from which smoke still rose. The conquerors had passed on. The survivors gathered in the red-stained temple before their curious god, a crystalline serpent on a fantastic stone altar. Their age had ended. Their world crumbled suddenly. They were the remnants of an otherwise extinct race. They could not rebuild their marvelous city, and they feared to remain within its broken walls, a prey to every passing tribe. Reynolds saw them take up their altar and its god, and followed an ancient man clad in mantle of feathers and wearing on his head a gem-set circlet of gold. He led them across the valley to a hidden cave. They entered, and squeezing through a narrow rift in the back wall, came into the vast networks of caverns honeycombing the hills. Reynolds saw them at work, exploring these labyrinths, excavating and enlarging, hewing the walls and floors smooth, enlarging the rift that led into the other cavern, and setting therein a cunningly hung door, so that it seemed part of the solid wall. Then an ever-shifting panorama denoted the passing of many centuries. The people lived in the caverns, and as time passed, they adapted themselves more and more to their surroundings, each generation going less frequently into the outer sunlight. They learned to obtain their food in shuddersome ways from the earth. Their ears grew smaller, their bodies more dwarfish, their eyes more cat-like. John Reynolds stood aghast as he watched the race changing through the ages. Outside in the valley, the deserted city crumbled and fell into ruins, becoming prey to lichen and weed and tree. Men came and briefly meditated among these ruins. Tall Mongolian warriors and dark, inscrutable little people men called the mound builders, and as the centuries passed, the visitors conformed more and more to the type of Indian as he knew it, until at last the only men who came were painted red men with stealthy feet and feathered scalp locks. None ever tarried long in that haunted place with its cryptic ruins. Meanwhile, in the caverns, the old people abode and grew strange and terrible. They fell lower and lower in the scale of humanity, forgetting first their written language and gradually their human speech, but in other ways they extended the boundaries of life. In their nighted kingdom, they discovered other, older caverns, which led them to the very bowels of the earth. They learned lost secrets, long forgotten or never known by man, sleeping in the blackness far below the hills. Darkness is conducive to silence, so they gradually lost the power of speech, a sort of telepathy taking its place, and with each grisly gain, they lost more of their human attributes. Their ears vanished, their noses grew snout-like, their eyes became unable to bear the light of the sun, and even the stars. They had long abandoned the use of fire, and the only light they used was the weird gleams evoked from their gigantic jewel on the altar, and even this they did not need. They changed in other ways. John Reynolds, watching, felt a cold sweat beat his body, for the slow transmutation of the old people was horrible to behold, and many and hideous were the shapes which moved among them before their ultimate mold and nature were revolved. Yet they remembered the sorcery of their ancestors, and added to this their own black wizardry developed far below the hills, and at last they attained the peak of that necromancy. John Reynolds had had horrific inklings of it in fragmentary glimpses of the old times, when the wizards of the old people had sent forth their spirits from their sleeping bodies to whisper evil terrible things in the ears of their enemies. A tribe of tall painted warriors came into the valley, bearing the body of a great chief, slain in tribal warfare. Long eons had passed of the ancient city, only scattered columns stood among the trees. A landslide had laid bare the entrance of the outer cavern. These the Indians found, and therein they placed the body of their chief with his weapons broken beside him. Then they blocked up the cave mouth with stones and took up their journey. But night caught them in the valley. Through all the ages, the old people had found no other entrance or exit to or from the pits, save the small outer cave. It was the one doorway between their grim realm and the world they had so long abandoned. Now they came through the secret door into the outer cavern, whose dim light they could endure, and John Reynolds' hair stood up at what he saw. For they took the corpse and laid it before the altar of the feather serpent, and an ancient wizard lay upon it, his mouth against the mouth of the dead. Above them tom-toms pulsed, and strange fires flickered, and the voiceless votaries with soundless chants invoked gods forgotten before the birth of Egypt, until inhuman voices bellowed in the outer darkness, and the sweep of monstrous wings filled the shadows. And slowly life ebbed from the sorcerer, and steered the limbs of the dead chief. The body of the wizard rolled limply aside, and the corpse of the chief stood up stiffly, and with puppet-like lips and glassy staring eyes it went up the dark tunnel and through the secret door into the outer cave. Its dead hands tore aside the stones, and into the starlight stalked the horror. Reynolds saw it walk stiffly under the showering trees, while the night things fled glimmering. He saw it come into the camp of the warriors. The rest was horror and madness, as the dead thing pursued its former companions and tore them limb from limb. The valley became a shambles before one of the braves, conquering his terror, turned on his pursuer and hewed through its spine with a stone axe. And even as the twice-slain corpse crumpled, Reynolds saw on the floor of the cavern before the cavern serpent the form of the wizard quicken and live as his spirit returned to him from the corpse he had caused it to animate. The soundless glee of incarnate demons shook the crawling blackness of the pits, and Reynolds shrank before the verminous fiends gloating over their newfound power to deal horror and death to the sons of men, their ancient enemies. But the word spread from clan to clan, and man came not to the Valley of the Lost. For many a century lay dreaming and deserted beneath the sky. Then came mounted braves with trailing war bonnets, painted with the colors of the Kiowas, warriors of the north who knew nothing of the mysterious valley. They pitched their camps in the very shadows of those sinister monoliths, which were now no more than shapeless stones. They placed their dead in a cavern, and Reynolds saw the horrors that took place when the dead came ravening by night among the living to slay and devour, and to drag screaming victims into the nighted caverns and the demoniac doom that awaited them. The legions of hell were loosed in the Valley of the Lost, where chaos reigned and nightmare and madness stalked. Those who were left alive and sane walled up the cavern and rode out the hills like men riding from hell. Once more, Lost Valley lay gaunt and naked to the stars. Then again, the coming of man broke the primal solitude, and smoke rose among the trees, and John Reynolds caught his breath with a start of horror as he saw these were white men, clad in the buckskins of an earlier day, 6 of them, so much alike that he knew they were brothers. He saw them fell trees and build a cabin in the clearing. He saw them hunt game in the mountains and begin clearing a field for corn. And all the time he saw the vermin of the hills waiting with ghoulish lust in the darkness. They could not look from their caverns with their nighted eyes, but by their godless sorcery they were aware of all that took place in the valley. They could not come forth in their own bodies in the light, but they waited with the patience of night and the still places. Reynolds saw one of the brothers find a cavern and open it. He entered, and the secret door hung open. The man went into the tunnel. He could not see in the darkness the shapes of horror that stole slavering about him, but in sudden panic he lifted his muzzle-loading rifle and fired blindly, screaming as the flash showed him the hellish forms that ringed them in. In the utter blackness following the vain shot they rushed, overthrowing him by the power of their numbers, sinking their snaky fangs into his flesh. As he died, he slashed half a dozen of them to pieces with his bowie knife, but the poison did its work quickly. Reynolds saw them drag the corpse before the altar. He saw again the horrible transmutation of the dead, which rose grinning vacantly and stalked forth. The sun had set in a welter of dull crimson. Night had fallen. To the cabin where his brother slept, wrapped in their blankets, stalked the dead. Silently the groping hand swung open the door. The horror crouched in the gloom, its bare teeth shining, its dead eyes gleaming glassily in the starlight. One of the brothers stirred and mumbled, then sat up and stared at the motionless shape in the doorway. He called the dead man's name. Then he shrieked hideously. The horror sprang. From John Reynolds' throat burst a cry of intolerable horror. Abruptly, the picture vanished with the smoke. He stood in the weird glow before the altar, the tom-toms throbbing softly and evilly, the fiendish faces hemming him in. And now from among the crypt, on his belly like the serpent he was, the one which wore the gemmed circlet, venom dripping from his bared fangs. Loathsomely he slithered toward John Reynolds, who fought the temptation to leap upon the foul thing and step out its life. There was no escape. He could send his bullets crashing through the swarm and mow down all in front of the muzzle, but those would be as nothing beside the hundreds who hemmed him in. He would die there in the waning light, and they would send his corpse blundering forth, lent a travesty of life by the spirit of the wizard, just as they had sent Saul Fletcher. John Reynolds grew tense as steel, and his wolf-like instinct to live rose above the maze of horror into which he had fallen, and suddenly his human mind rose above the vermin who threatened him, and he was electrified by a swift thought that was like an inspiration. With a fierce, inarticulate cry of triumph, he bounded sideways just as the crawling monstrosity lunged. It missed him, sprawling headlong, and Reynolds snatched from the altar the carven serpent and holding it on high, thrust against it in the muzzle of his cocked pistol. He did not need to speak. In the dying light, his eyes blazed madly. The old people wavered back. Before them lay he whose peaked skull Reynolds' pistol had shattered. They knew a crook of his trigger finger would splinter their fantastic god into shining bits. For a tense space the tableau held. Then Reynolds felt their silent surrender, freedom in exchange for their god. It was again born on him that these beings were not truly bestial, since true beasts know no gods, and this knowledge was the most terrible, for it meant that these creatures had evolved into a type neither bestial nor human, a type outside of nature and sanity. The snakish figures gave back on each side, and the waning light sprang up again. As he went up the tunnel, they were close at his heels, and in the dancing, uncertain glow, he could not be sure whether they walked as a man walks, or crawled as a snake crawls. He had a vague impression that their gait was hideously compounded of both. He swerved far aside to avoid the sprawling bulk that had been Saul Fletcher, and so, with his gun muzzle pressed hard against the shining brittle image borne in his left hand, he came to the short flight of steps which led up to the secret door. There they came to a standstill. He turned to face them. They ringed him in close arm circle, and he understood that they feared to open the secret door lest he dash with their image through the cavern into the sunlight, where they could not follow. Nor would he set down the god until the door was opened. At least they withdrew several yards, and he cautiously set the image on the floor at his feet where he could snatch it up How they opened the door he never knew, but it swung wide, and he backed slowly up the steps, his gun trained on the glittering god. He had almost reached the door. One back-thrown hand gripped the edge when the light went out suddenly, and the rush came. A volcanic burst of effort shot him backwards through the door, which was already rushing shut. As he leaped, he emptied his gun full into the fiendish faces that suddenly filled the dark opening. They dissolved in red ruin, and as he raced madly from the outer cavern, he heard the soft closing of the secret door, shutting that realm of horror from the human world. In the glow of the westering sun, John Reynolds staggered drunkenly, clutching at stones and trees as a madman clutches at realities. The keen tenseness that held him when he fought for his life fell from him and left him a quivering shell of disrupted nerves. An insane titter broke through his lips, and he rocked to and fro in ghastly laughter he could not check. Then the clink of hoofs on stone sent him leaping behind a cluster of boulders. It was some hidden instinct which led him to take refuge. His conscious mind was too dazed and chaotic for thought or action. Into the clearing rode Jonas McBride and his followers, and a sob tore through Reynolds' throat. At first he did not recognize them, did not realize that he had ever seen them before. The feud, with all other sane and normal things, lay lost and forgotten far back in dim vistas beyond the black tunnels of madness. Two figures rode from the other side of the clearing, Bill Ord and one of the outlaw followers of the McGrails. Strapped to Ord's saddle were several sticks of dynamite, done into a compact package. "Well, gee whiz," hailed young Ord. "I sure didn't expect to meet you all here. Did you get him?" "Nah," snapped old Jonas. "He's done-fooled us again. We came up with his horse, but he wasn't on it. The rein was snapped like it had died and it broke away. I don't know where he is, but we'll get him. I'm a-going on to the Antelope to get some more of the boys. You all get Saul's body out of that cave and follow me as fast as you can." He reined away and vanished through the trees, and Reynolds, his heart in his mouth, saw the other four approach the cavern. "Well, by God," exclaimed Jack Solomon fiercely, "somebody's not been here. Look, them rocks are torn down." John Reynolds watched as one paralyzed. If he sprang up and called to them, they would shoot him down before he could voice his warning. Yet it was not that which held him as in vice. It was sheer horror which robbed them of thought and action and froze his tongue to the roof of his mouth. His lips parted, but no sound came forth. As in a nightmare, he saw his enemies disappear into the cavern. Their voices, muffled, came back to him. "By golly, Saul's gone. Look here, boys. Here's the door in the back wall. By thunder, it's open. Let's take a look." Suddenly, from within the bowels of the hills crashed a fusillade of shots, a burst of hideous screams. Then silence closed like a clammy fog over the valley of the lost. John Reynolds, finding voice at last, cried out as a wounded beast cries, and beat his temples with his clenched fists. He brandished them to the heavens, shrieking wordless blasphemies. Then he ran staggeringly to Bill Ord's horse, which grazed tranquilly with the others beneath the trees. With clammy hands he tore away the package of dynamite, and without separating the sticks, he punched a hole in the end of the middle stick with a twig. Then he cut a very short piece of fuse and slipped the cap over one end, which he inserted into the hole in the dynamite. In a pocket of the rolled-up slicker bound behind the saddle, he found a match, and lighting the fuse, he hurled the bundle into the cavern. Hardly had it struck the back wall when, with an earthquake roar, it exploded. The concussion nearly hurt him off his feet. The whole mountain rocked, and with a thunderous crash, the cave roof fell. Tons and tons of shattered rock crashed down to obliterate all marks of Ghost Cave and to shut the door to the pits forever. John Reynolds walked slowly away, and suddenly the whole horror swept upon him. The earth seemed hideously alive under his feet, the sun foul and blasphemous over his head. The light was sickly, yellowish and evil, and all things were polluted by the unknown knowledge locked in his skull like hidden drums beating ceaselessly in the blackness beneath the hills. He had closed one door forever, but what other nightmare shapes might lurk in hidden places and the dark pits of the earth, gloating over the souls of man? His knowledge was a reeking blasphemy which would never let him rest. Forever in his soul would whisper the drums that throbbed in those dark pits where lord demons had once been men. He had looked on ultimate foulness, and his knowledge was attained, which would never let him stand clean before man again, or touch the flesh of any living thing without a shudder. If man, molded of divinity, could sink to such verminous obscenities, who could contemplate his eventual destiny unshaken, and if such beings as the old people existed, what other horrors might not lurk beneath the visible surface of the universe? He was suddenly aware that he had glimpsed the grinning skull beneath the mask of life, and that the glimpse made life intolerable. All certainty and stability had been swept away, leaving a mad welter of lunacy, nightmare, and stalking horror. John Reynolds drew his gun, and his horny thumb drew back the heavy hammer, thrusting the muzzle against his temple. He pulled the trigger. The shot crashed, echoing through the hills, and the last of the fighting Reynoldses pitched headlong. Old Jonas McGrail, galloping back at the sound of the blast, found him where he lay, and wondered that his face should be that of an old man, his hair white as hoar frost.